Hello, everyone. Welcome to the latest episode of Mayor Brown's video series at the Crossroads, CFTC and DOJ Enforcement. My name is Matt Kluchenek, a partner at Mayor Brown, member of Mayor Brown's Litigation and Dispute Resolution Group, and I'm joined again today by my partner, Glen Kopp, former federal prosecutor out of the Southern District of New York and a member of Mayor Brown's litigation group and white collar defense team. As you may know, each week we seek to bring to you a timely topic relating to CFTC and DOJ enforcement. Last week we spoke a little bit, we provided an overview of the spoofing enforcement environment, which we're going to focus on for several weeks here. Today we're going to turn to the roles of self-regulatory organizations, or SROs. So be that exchanges, markets, or trade associations, and how much impact they've had and what the trends are with respect to these types of entities. So with that, let me turn it over to Glen.
Thanks, Matt. So why don't we start with this? Matt, if you could give us sort of an overview or sort of a big picture view of the sort of SRO spoofing enforcement environment that we're in right now.
Sure, Glenn, thanks. So, SROs and particularly exchanges in the commodity space were very quick to the beat early. It was CME Group back in September 2014 when it issued its anti-spoofing rule, which was and is Rule 575. So that goes back quite a ways. And since then, the exchanges in particular have been very, very aggressive about prosecuting spoofing and related price manipulation abuses. We've seen over the years, 7 years or so now, innumerable cases, many cases. I don't know the exact numbers, but I would probably say for every, one CFTC enforcement action, there's probably been anywhere from 10 to a dozen exchange actions. And so, the SROs and the exchanges in particular, very aggressive. That has not abated, and we continue to see a lot of cases in the pipeline, a lot of actions, maybe not as many as a couple of years ago, but again, remains really, really robust. And it's a situation here, Glenn, where oftentimes, not always, but oftentimes, we'll see a spoofing manipulation investigation start at the exchange SRO level. And then it may work its way up to the CFTC and then ultimately the Department of Justice. But oftentimes the starting point will be at the exchange level.
And with that, Matt, the starting point, how is it that the exchanges are actually able to identify or sniff out, so to speak, spoofing activity?
Sure. Having been involved on behalf of clients with many spoofing manipulation investigations and actions with these SROs, do not ever discount the surveillance capabilities of the markets. They are extraordinarily robust. They're infused with artificial intelligence, develop various, able to detect and constantly develop and focus on patterns of trading. And keep in mind that, the markets, they have the order book. They have every piece of the order book, every message. And by message, we mean orders and whether those orders are canceled, modified, executed, whatever the case may be. They have the order book. And so they've developed systems, and I would argue that relatively easily can identify suspicious patterns of trading activity. And so important to bear that in mind.
And Matt, when they do identify that suspicious trading activity, what are the applicable rules that the SROs are relying on in enforcing anti-spoofing activity?
Yeah, it depends on the SRO. It depends upon the exchange. If we just briefly look at the two largest exchanges in the US. So if we look at ICE futures, it's Rule 4.02L. If we look at CME Group, it would be Rule 575. Each of these markets has also issued and continues to update on a periodic basis frequently asked questions and answers. And these are illustrative and should always be consulted. And by the way, the exchanges take the view that a violation or breach of of guidance, so a response instruction in an FAQ, is equivalent to violating the actual rule itself. And the FAQs are long and detailed. And again, there's guidance, but there's also a lot of mandates in those rules. And so you've got to treat those FAQs essentially as rules. And just to focus a little bit on CME Group 575, originally there were 4 components, 4 types of prohibitions. Now there's 5 prohibitions. And the prohibitions run the gamut. And keep in mind, Rule 575 is titled Disruptive Practices Prohibited. So the focus really occurs on disruption. And within that realm, that umbrella of disruption, we have spoofing. But in addition to spoofing, we have things like it's prohibited to send excessive messages. We've seen a number of actions where there might be algorithms that engage in what we call flickering. It's just a constant, sending of orders, so on and so forth. It's not necessarily spoofing, but that is viewed and can be viewed as a disruptive practice. Similarly, a rogue trading algorithm. We've seen some cases, had some cases where algorithms did something not necessarily with the intent to spoof, but functioned in a way that CME Group and or certain market participants believed was disruptive. And so that can also be a basis. And there's this broad, catch-all in 575, which is D, which really just focuses on whether or not a trader or a firm engages intentionally or recklessly in disruptive trading. And what we've seen over the years, what I've seen a number of times is, quite frankly, and this is separate and aside from spoofing itself, but if there is a certain trading strategy that's been executed and there are, multiple market participant complaints, that almost standing alone can be the basis for triggering an investigation into potential disruption. And so there's a lot to deal with under 575, for example, in addition to spoofing. And again, ICE futures, similar policy, similar view, as well as the other futures exchanges.
Now, we've been talking here about spoofing activity in conjunction with sort of trading activity. But can spoofing actually be prosecuted outside of a trading session?
In a sense, yeah. Well, the answer to that most clearly is yes. It's not necessarily characterized as spoofing, Glenn, but it can be, and more often would be looked at or viewed as a disruptive trading practice. So you have, what is generally speaking normal trading hours. That's a period of time when trading occurs. There's a start period. There's ultimately a stop period. But before trading starts, there is a pre-opening session. And during that pre-opening session, orders are placed, orders can be canceled, and ultimately something we call an IOP, indicative opening price, is developed by virtue of these pre-opening orders. So there's no executions that actually occur, but these orders, the orders that are placed, inform the opening price. And that opening price, when the proverbial bell rings, is based upon the pre-opening orders. And so CME has, again, for a number of years, brought cases where they viewed transaction activity or messaging activity during the pre-opening session to be a form of intentional or reckless disruption. So if, for example, you have a trader who is placing orders in the pre-open session and then canceling and placing and canceling, or doing whatever the case may be, from CME's perspective, in order to impact the opening price, that can be the basis for an investigation and a prosecution by CME Group. And we've seen that a relatively large number of times where the focus has been on that pre-opening session.
Matt, for the last topic of this quick hit today on spoofing, I wanted to ask you a little bit about the role of the securities SROs in prosecuting spoofing, if you could just briefly touch on that.
Yeah. So I should mention, when we talk about SROs in the commodity space, I think as many of us may know, there's, of course, the National Futures Association. The NFA, though, has not focused on spoofing prosecutions. It's deferred largely to the exchanges and the CFTC. In the security space, however, we've seen FINRA be fairly active with respect to spoofing investigations and prosecutions. There's a number of rules. There's just and equitable principles, market access deficiency, supervisory rules that FINRA typically tends to bring spoofing, price manipulation cases under, but very robust. And then in addition to FINRA, the various securities markets also have rules with respect to spoofing and manipulation and prohibitions therefrom. And so the markets have also been active. And so in the SRO space with respect to securities, again, significant activity, and really important to understand the various rules. There's some nuances, which we'll get into in a later session, between the securities markets and futures markets when it comes to prosecutions and some definitions. But safe to say that the prohibitions are alive and well in the securities markets as well.
So Matt, if you could, can you just sort of wrap it up maybe with a few takeaways based on what we've talked about here today?
Sure. I think, a key takeaway would be that of surveillance. At times, clients have come to us and they may have identified what they think is suspicious activity. A question oftentimes is, well, will the exchanges find out? And the answer to that almost always is yes. Again, given the exchange's robust surveillance capabilities and access to the entire order book. So that's really important. It's also really important in terms of a spoofing investigation. If it arises at the exchange level, be sensitive, and from a strategic perspective, think about where it could go. So it may start off at the exchange. And again, as we've discussed, oftentimes, but not always, will actually, ultimately land with the CFTC and potentially the Department of Justice. So the starting point is often the exchange, but that's where things have to be managed in the first instance.
Excellent. Well, thank you very much, Matt. And thank you everybody for joining us today. And we look forward to seeing you again at the Crossroads.
Thanks.